So, welcome to our accounts receivable practice questions. So, ganito ang magiging mechanics ng ating practice questions na ito. I-flash ko po ang questions sa screen mo, gaya nito. Tapos, i-pause mo yung screen. Pag na-solve mo na ang problem, then play it again for the next questions. Sa solutions naman, ganito ang gagawin natin. So yan ang beginning balance natin ng the allowance for doubtful accounts. Tapos, ang sabi ng problem natin is, during the year, the accounts receivable of 35,000 were written off. So, ano ang effect ng write-off? So, isusulat ko lahat ng mga concepts na kakailanganin natin para ma-analyze natin yung question for each questions. Then, isusulat natin dito yung mga solutions. Alright? Yung mga links na kakailanganin mo for the video lectures on accounts receivable, nandito po sa description ng video practice questions na ito. Then, if you are ready, halika, samahan mo akong mag-analyze ng accounts receivable practice questions. Alright, question number 1 tayo. Alright, the requirements on question number 1 is, what amount should Aubrey report for accounts receivable before allowances for sales returned and uncollectible account at December 31st of the current year? Alright, so ang tinatanong is yung amount lang kung saan hindi natin i-deduct or i-minus yung allowances for sales returns and uncollectible account. Sa pag-solve ng problem na ito, you can solve the problems by using the T accounts. So kung mas sanay ka naman sa ganitong pag-solve ng problems, then kunin mo sa ganito. Then dito naman ang mga journal entries natin kung saan may effect ito sa ating accounts receivable. The following information relates to Aubrey Company's accounts receivable for the current year. Accounts receivable January 1st is our beginning balance ng ating accounts receivable account. Alright? So, kasama yan sa ating solutions. Amounting to 650,000. Alright, second item is the credit sales for the year. So, sa credit sales, ang entry natin is debit to accounts receivable and credit to sales. Alright? Ang effect niyan sa ating accounts receivable ay additions. So, when you debit an accounts receivable, nag-a-add ka sa accounts receivable na yan. So, we add credit sales. Amounting to 2,700,000. Another item is sales return for the year. So, sa sales returns, ang entry natin is debit to sales return and credit to accounts receivable. So, kapag ang transactions na yun ay nasa credit side ng iyong normal balance, minus yan sa ating accounts receivable. So, we minus our sales return for the year of 75,000. Huwag kang malito sa sales return at allowance for sales return, okay? Sa sales return na ito ay actual na return na ng company. Yung allowance for sales return, yan pa yung mga estimated nila na pwedeng mag-return ng mga customers sa susunod na taon. Then another item is accounts written off during the year. 40,000. So, sa write-off, ang entry natin is debit to allowance for uncollectible accounts and credit to accounts receivable. So, nag-credit tayo na accounts receivable, ang effect niya sa ating T account, so minus yan. Alright? So, we are going to minus our write-off. amounting to 40,000. Now, another item is collections from the customer during the year. Alright, amounting to 2,150,000. Our entry on the collections is debit to cash and then we credit to the accounts receivable. Siyempre, iaalisin na natin sa ating accounts receivable dahil nga nasingil na po natin yon. So, the effect on your T account is on the credit side. So, we will minus our collections. Alright, in the amount of 2,150,000. Another item is estimated future sales return at December 31st. Ang kailangan lang natin na amount is yung amount before the allowances for the sales returns in uncollectible account. So, ito lang po ang kasali sa ating solutions. So, our answer is so we have an accounts receivable before allowances for sales returns in uncollectible accounts of 1,085,000. So ang answer po natin ay letter C. Alright, question number 2. What is the requirement for question number 2? By what amount should OSF adjust its allowance for uncollectible accounts at year end? So, ang tinatanong dito, yung i-adjust natin sa allowance for uncollectible accounts. Let me give you an overview kung paano natin nako-compute yung ating bad debts expense. We have 3 methods of estimating the bad debts expense. So, yung bad debts expense na account ay parehas lang po yon sa uncollectible account expense. Parehas din lang yun sa doubtful account expense. Alright? Yung pare-parehas lang po ang ibig sabihin nun. Ito namang allowance for doubtful accounts, allowance for uncollectible account, allowance for bad debts, ay pare-parehas lang din po ang ibig sabihin nun. There are 3 methods para ma-estimate natin kung magkano ang bad debts expense ng isang company or magkano ang doubtful account expense or itong tinatawag na uncollectible account expense ng isang company. At itong tatlong method na ito ay first, we have our aging of accounts receivable, percentage of accounts receivable, at ito nga pong percentage of our credit sales. Itong dalawang itong aging of accounts receivables at percentage of accounts receivable, yung makukuha nating amount dito sa aging of accounts receivable or the percentage of the accounts receivable, ito po yung desired ending balance ng allowance for doubtful account. Ito namang percentage of credit sales, yung amount na makukuha natin dito, yan na po yung bad debts expense natin. Alright? Na ina-add natin sa allowance for doubtful accounts para makuha natin yung ending balance ng allowance for doubtful accounts na ito. To solve this problem, pwede tayong gumamit ng T account or pwede tayong gumamit ng formula. Ang gagawin ko is the formula kasi mas sanay ako sa formula. OSF company has the following sales and accounts receivable balances prior to any adjustments at the year end. Credit sales of 10 million and accounts receivable of 3 million. And allowance for uncollectible accounts, debit balance. Remember, debit balance, itong problem na ito of 50,000. Alright? OSF company uses 3% of accounts receivable to determine its allowance for uncollectible accounts at year end. Okay, ang ginagamit niya is percentage of accounts receivable. So, yung makukuha nating percentage of accounts receivable, yan na po yung desired ending balance ng ating allowance for doubtful accounts. Alright? Yung account na ito, yan ang magiging ending balance natin. To solve this problem, mag-uumpisa tayo sa unadjusted balance ng ating allowance for uncollectible accounts. Ang allowance for doubtful accounts or allowance for uncollectible accounts normal side or normal balance is supposed to be on the credit side. Dito sa problem na ito ay debit balance ang ating allowance for uncollectible accounts. So, ang ibig sabihin, dahil nasa debit side ang balance niya, ima-minus natin yan. Now, ang sabi ng problem natin, OSF company uses 3% of accounts receivable to determine its allowance for uncollectible accounts at your end. So, ang ibig sabihin, itong ending natin, itong ending balance natin ng allowance for doubtful accounts ay 3% of the accounts receivable. Ang accounts receivable natin sa problem na ito is 3 million. So, 3 million multiplied by 3%, this is 90,000. Yan po ang dapat nating ending balance ng ating allowance for uncollectible accounts. Now, ang tinatanong ng problem is kung magkano yung i-adjust natin sa ating allowance for uncollectible accounts, yung adjustment. So, magkano kung 50 ito at 90 ang ending balance natin, meron tayong 140,000 na i-adjust. At ano itong 140,000? Yan po ang ating bad debts expense. Alright? So, our answer is letter D. Alright, question number 3. The requirement on question number 3 is the amount collected from the customers on accounts receivable during year 2 was, so ang hinahanap ng problem ay kung magkano ang collections ng company sa buong taon. Para makuha natin na accounts receivable ending, so ang mga transactions that affects our accounts receivable are credit sales. From our accounts receivable beginning, ina-add po natin ang credit sales, yung mga sales natin on account. Then kapag nag-return ang mga customers, mina-minus po natin yan sa ating accounts receivable. Our entry for the sales return is debit to sales returns and credit to accounts receivable. Mina-minus din natin yung write-off. Ano bang entry natin sa write-off? At bakit minus siya sa ating accounts receivable? Our entry for the write-off is debit to allowance for doubtful accounts and credit to accounts receivable. Alright? So, credit to accounts receivable, ang ibig sabihin, mina-minus natin yan sa accounts receivable. Then, of course, kapag nakakolekta na tayo, kina-cancel din natin, inaalis din natin yan sa ating accounts receivable. Okay? Then, we will end up with our accounts receivable ending. Alright? Kung mas sanay ka sa T account, then kunin mo sa T account. William Company had an accounts receivable balance of 225,000 on December 31st or year 1. So, ano itong 225,000? Yan po yung ending balance last year. Alright? Na magiging beginning balance ng year 2. So, ang hinahanap ng problem, yung collections for year 2. This 225,000, yan po ang magiging beginning balance natin na accounts receivable. Diyan po tayo mag-uumpisa ng ating solutions. And 150,000 on December 31st, year 2. So, dito sa problem, binigay na sa'yo agad ang ending balance ng iyong accounts receivable ending. The company wrote off 50,000 of accounts receivable during year 2. So, anong effect ng ating write-off? Minus siya. So, we will minus this write-off to the beginning balance of 50,000. Then, sales for the year 2 totaled 600,000 and 75% of sales were on account. So, anong ibig sabihin? Ang buong sales ng company, William Company, ay 600,000. And this 600,000 is composed of the cash sales at saka yung sales on account or yung credit sales. Ang sabi ng problem, 75% of this sales were on account. So, ang credit sales natin ay 75% of the 600,000. Yan ang accounts receivable natin. So, our credit sales, so meron tayong credit sales na 450,000, which is addition to your accounts receivable beginning. Kasi ang entry natin dito is debit to accounts receivable and credit to sales. Now, ang hinahanap ng problem ay hindi yung ending balance, kundi yung collection ng company. Okay, remember, our collections is minus on our accounts receivable. Entry natin sa collections is debit to cash and credit to accounts receivable. So, that's why it's minus. So, ito, ang hinahanap natin. So, ipa-plug in mo lang ito kung magkano yung missing amount. And the missing amount is 475,000. And so, our answer is letter A. Alright, question number 4 tayo. The requirement is how much should Fairway report as bad debts expense on its year 5 income statement? Alright, so ang tinatanong dito is yung bad debts expense. Bad debts expense is also known as doubtful account expense and also known as uncollectible account expense. Alright? Pare-parehas lang ang ibig sabihin nun. Ito pong makukuha nating amount by using the aging of accounts receivable at percentage of accounts receivable. Itong amount na ito, this is actually your desired ending balance of your allowance for doubtful accounts. Alright? Ito po yung dapat na magiging ending balance ng ating allowance for doubtful accounts. Alright? Pero kung ang gagamitin natin is percentage of the credit sales, yung amount na makukuha mo dito sa pag-calculate, ito na po yung bad debts expense natin. On its December 31st year 4 balance sheet, Fairway Company reported accounts receivable of $850,000, net of an allowance for doubtful accounts of $45,000. On December 31st year 5, Fairway's company's balance sheet shows gross accounts receivable of $922,000 and Fairway's income statement reported sales of $3 million. Alright, during the year, accounts receivable of $35,000 were written off and $18,000 were recovered. Based on past experience, 5% of Fairway's ending accounts receivable are uncollectible. So, anong ginagamit ni Fairway Company? Ang ginagamit niya method is the percentage of accounts receivable. So remember, kapag ito ang gagamitin natin, yung amount na makukuha natin, yan ang desired ending balance natin. To solve these problems, we are going to start with the beginning balance of our allowance for doubtful accounts. Alright? Amounting to 45,000, alright? Nandyan sa net of allowance for doubtful accounts of 45,000. So, during the year, accounts receivable of 35,000 were written off. So, yung write-off, ima-minus natin yan sa ating allowance for doubtful accounts. Ano bang entry natin sa write-off? We debit allowance for doubtful accounts and we credit the accounts receivable. Alright? So, dito sa allowance for doubtful account natin ay minus ang write-off. And 18,000 were recovered. So, itong recovery natin ay nasa credit side. That means we are going to add this recovery to the allowance for doubtful accounts. Ano bang entry natin sa recovery? Our entry will be debit to accounts receivable and credit to allowance for doubtful accounts. Alright? Then, yung collections mo from that recovery is a debit to cash and credit to the accounts receivable. Alright? So, nag-credit tayo ng allowance for doubtful accounts from that entry. So, yung recovery is addition to our allowance for doubtful accounts. Alright, amounting to 18,000. Before we plug in our bad debts expense, ang balance natin before our bad debts expense is 28,000. This is your balance before bad debts expense. Ang sabi ng problem, ang ginagamit ng company is 5% of the ending accounts receivable. And how much is our accounts receivable? Our accounts receivable is 922,000. So, we add our bad debts expense. So, hindi pa natin alam kung magkano ang bad debts expense natin. Pero, malalaman natin by calculating our desired ending balance of our allowance for doubtful account. So, ito po yung allowance based on our percentage of the accounts receivable of 922,000. So based on our percentage of the accounts receivable, this is our ending balance of our allowance for doubtful accounts, which is 46,100. So ipa-plug in lang po natin ang ating bad debts expense. Alright? And our plug-in is 18,100. So our answer is 18,100. Yan po ang bad debts expense natin. So our answer is letter A. Alright, question number 5. The requirement is, how much should Blue Water report as accounts receivable net of allowance for doubtful accounts on its year 2 balance sheet? So, ang hinahanap ng problem dito is yung amount ng accounts receivable kung saan dinidak na natin ang allowance for doubtful accounts. And this amount is also called as net realizable value. So, mag-uumpisa tayo sa accounts receivable ended with the accounts receivable ending, ililes natin yung allowance for doubtful accounts. Alright, ito ang formula na gagamitin natin. So, we are going to start with the accounts receivable ending, and then we will less our allowance for doubtful accounts na ending din. Tapos, makikita natin kung magkano ang ating net realizable value of our accounts receivable. Yan po ang hinahanap ng problem natin. On its December 31st year 1 balance sheet, Blue Water Company reported accounts receivable of 855,000, net of an allowance for doubtful accounts of 45,000. So ano ba itong 855,000? Yan ang net realizable value last year. So hindi po yan ang hinahanap ng problem. Ang hinahanap ng problem is yung net realizable value ng year 2 sa balance sheet. On December 31st, year 2, Blue Water Company's balance sheet showed gross accounts receivable of 922,000. And yan na po yung ating accounts receivable ending. Alright? Now, magkano kaya ang ating allowance for doubtful account? In Blue Water income statement reported sales of 3 million, 60% are credit sales. During the year, accounts receivable of 35,000 were written off and 18,000 were recovered. So to be able to solve for the ending balance of our allowance for doubtful accounts, mag-uumpisa tayo sa beginning balance ng allowance for doubtful accounts. Alright? Alright, magkano ang ating allowance for doubtful accounts beginning? 45,000. So, yan ang beginning balance natin ng the allowance for doubtful accounts. Tapos, ang sabi ng problem natin is, during the year, the accounts receivable of 35,000 were written off. So, ano ang effect ng write-off sa ating allowance for doubtful account? Our entry for writing off an accounts receivable is debit to allowance for doubtful accounts, then credit to accounts receivable. Yan po ang ating entry kapag nagra-write off tayo ng accounts receivable. So, we debit our allowance for doubtful accounts. For this 35,000 na ni-write off ni Blue Water, yan po ay minus sa ating allowance for doubtful accounts. And 18,000 were recovered. So ano ba ang effect ng recovery sa ating allowance for doubtful accounts? Ang recovery is addition to our allowance for doubtful accounts. Ano bang entry natin sa recovery? We debit our accounts receivable dahil naka-recover tayo and credit to allowance for doubtful accounts to set up this accounts receivable na nasingil natin. And then we will debit our cash na nakolekta natin, tapos aalisin natin ulit sa accounts receivable natin and credit to accounts receivable. So sa recovery, ang effect niya sa ating allowance for doubtful accounts ay credit. So we are adding this recovery to our balance. So we plus recovery. Based on past experience, 2% of blue water credit sales are uncollectible. Anong ginagamit na method ng company? Percentage of credit sales. So remember, percentage of credit sales, yan na po yung bad debts expense natin. Itong amount makukompute natin, yan na po yung bad debts expense natin. I-add lang natin yan sa ating remaining allowance for doubtful account, alright? Before this bad debts expense, yan na po ang magiging ending natin. Alright? So, we will add our bad debts expense or doubtful accounts expense. Parehas lang po yan. So, the computations of your doubtful account expense or bad debts expense is 3 million multiplied by 60% because sabi ng problem is 60% are credit sales. So, 3 million times 60%, which is the credit sales percentage, multiplied by 2%, we come out with a bad debts expense or doubtful account expense as 36,000. So, ina-add po natin yan. Alright? Dahil ang ginagamit natin ay percentage of credit sales. Then we will come out with ending balance of our allowance for doubtful accounts of 64,000. Ito po ang ating ending balance ng ating allowance for doubtful accounts. Yan po ang ima-minus natin dito. 64,000. Then we will have 858,000. Ito po yung answer natin. Yan ang hinahanap ng problem. And our answer will be letter A. Alright, question number 6. So, the requirement on question number 6 is, what amount of allowance for uncollectible accounts should Nestle report in its December 31st year 2 balance sheets? So, anong hinahanap ng problem? Ang hinahanap ng problem ay yung ending balance ng allowance for uncollectible accounts ng December 31st year 2. At December 31st year 1, Nestle Company allowance for uncollectible accounts had a credit balance of 30,000. So, yung 30,000, yan po yung ending balance last year, December 31st of year 1. So, meaning to say, yan po ang magiging beginning balance natin ng January 1st of year 2. Alright? During year 2, Nestle wrote off accounts of 45,000. At December 31st, year 2, an aging of accounts receivable indicates that 50,000 of the December 31st, year 2 receivable may be uncollectible. So, let's go back to our concept. Aging of accounts receivable, percentage of the accounts receivable, and a percentage of the credit sales. Alright? Kung ang gagamitin natin ay aging of accounts receivable or itong percentage of accounts receivable, yung amount na makukuha natin dyan, yan na po yung ending balance natin sa allowance for doubtful accounts. Alright? Itong amount na yan, yan ang magiging ending balance natin. Back to the problem. At December 31st, year 2, an aging of accounts receivable indicated that 50,000 of the December 31st, year 2 receivable may be uncollectible. So, anong hinahanap ng problem? Yung ending balance. At ang ginagamit ng problem ay yung aging of your accounts receivable. So, ang ibig sabihin, yung 50,000, yan na rin po yung answer natin. Alright? So, our answer is 50,000 according to the aging of the accounts receivable. So, our answer is letter D. If you know the concept, kahit balik-balik ta rin ka, makukuha mo pa rin ang answer. Alright? Alright, question number 7. The requirements on question number 7 is, in its December 31st balance sheet, what amount should Mars report for allowance for discount? So this time, discount tayo. Alright? Mars Incorporation sells to wholesaler on terms of 2/15 net 30. So, anong ibig sabihin ng terms na ito? 2/15. So, ang ibig sabihin na si Mars, magbibigay siya ng 2% sa mga customer kung magbabayad sila within the 15 days. Ang ibig sabihin, 98% lang ang babayaran ng customer. The net 30, ang ibig sabihin is hindi na siya makaka-avail ng discount, but kailangan magbayad siya within 30 days. Alright? Now, Mars Incorporation sells to wholesaler on terms of 215. Mars has no cash sales, but 50% of Mars customers take advantage of the discount. So 50% lang sa lahat ng mga customers niya ang nag-a-avail ng discount. The other 50% hindi na sila nag-a-avail ng discount. Alright? Mars uses the gross method of recording sales and trade receivables. Mars trade receivables at December 31st revealed the following. So kung makikita mo itong 0 to 15 days, 16 to 30 days, this is your aging of your accounts receivable. So kung titignan mo sa aging of the accounts receivable, so sino pa ang pwedeng mag-avail ng 2% discount? Siyempre, yung 0 to 15 days outstanding na accounts receivable lang ang pwedeng mag-avail ng 2%. Yung 16 days and above, hindi na sila makaka-avail ng discount. Kasi nga, it's beyond the discount period. Alright? So, ang answer natin dito is 300,000, which is the 0 to 15 days outstanding, which is amounting to 300,000 multiplied by 50%. So, remember, sabi ng problem natin, Mars has no cash sales, but 50% of Mars customer take advantage of the discount. So 50% lang ang nag-a-avail ng discount. Then multiplied by 2%. Yan po yung discount. So ang answer natin is 3,000. Yan po ang answer natin. Alright? And our answer is letter B. Alright, problem number 8. So, sa problem number 8 na ito, ang tinatanong is, ano ba ang effect ng recovery or collections after the accounts was written off by the company? Ano ang magiging effect kapag nakakolekta siya ng kanyang mga accounts receivable na ni-write off niya? Alright? Ano ang magiging effect sa kanyang accounts receivable at ano ang magiging effect sa kanyang allowance for doubtful accounts or allowance for uncollectible accounts? Alright? So, when the allowance method of recognizing uncollectible accounts is used, allowance method, how would the collections of an account previously written off affects accounts receivable and the allowance for uncollectible accounts? Okay, first of all, ano ang magiging entry natin kapag ni-write off natin dahil ang company hindi na daw siya makakasingil sa kanyang accounts receivable na yon, i-write off na niya. So, our entry to write off this accounts receivable is debit to allowance for uncollectible accounts or debit to allowance for doubtful accounts, parehas lang yan, okay? Or allowance for bad debts, parehas din po yan. Allowance for uncollectible accounts and credit to the accounts receivable. So, aalisin na natin yan sa accounts receivable natin kasi hindi na nga po tayo makakasingil. Then, naka-recover ngayon yung company. Anong ibig sabihin? Yung mga customer na ni-write off mo ang kanilang mga accounts receivable, nagbayad sila. Bigla silang nagbayad. Nagising sila at nagbayad sila. So, itong recovery na ito, ang una natin gagawin, we will set up that accounts receivable. Isi-set up natin ulit yung accounts receivable na yon na nasingil natin. Alright? For example, nakasingil tayo ng 10,000. Our entry will be debit to accounts receivable and credit to the allowance for uncollectible accounts of 10,000, for example. Then, i-record natin yung cash na nakolekta natin. So, our entry will be debit to cash and credit to the accounts receivable. So, kung titignan mo sa recovery, yan ang tanong ng problem. Ang effect niya sa iyong accounts receivable, no effect. Wala siyang effect sa iyong accounts receivable. Alright? Kung titingnan mo naman, increased ang ating allowance for uncollectible accounts. Yan ang effect niya sa ating allowance for uncollectible accounts. At kung titingnan mo din yung entry natin sa recovery, we increased our cash. Pero ang tinatanong ng problem mo ay yung accounts receivable lang at yung allowance for doubtful accounts or uncollectible accounts. So, sa accounts receivable at saka sa allowance. Therefore, sa accounts receivable, wala tayong effect kung recovery. No effect. Sa allowance naman, increase tayo. Bakit increase? Kasi the normal side of your allowance for doubtful accounts or allowance for uncollectible accounts is credit side. Alright? Kung nag-credit ka ng allowance, ini-increase mo yan. Kung nag-debit ka ng allowance, dinidecrease mo yan. Alright? Hindi tinatanong ng problem ang effect sa write-off. Ang tinatanong ng problem ay yung effect sa recovery, sa collections. So, our answer is letter D. Alright, question number 9 tayo. So, what is the requirement on question number 9? Alright, in each December 31st, year 2 balance sheets, what amount should Sunset report as accounts receivable net of allowance for uncollectible accounts? So, ang hinahanap ng problem ay yung net realizable value ng accounts receivable or yung accounts receivable amount net of the allowance for uncollectible accounts. So, ang una natin gagawin ay titignan natin kung magkano ang accounts receivable ending at saka yung allowance for uncollectible accounts ending. And then, ima-minus natin yung dalawang amount na yon. Yun ang hinahanap ng problem natin. So, in its December 31st, year 1 balance sheet, Sunset Company reported accounts receivable of $850,000, net of allowance for uncollectible accounts of $50,000. Remember, ang hinahanap ng problem natin ay year 2. So, itong $850,000 net of the allowance for uncollectible accounts of $50,000, ito yung net realizable value last year. Para makita natin ang accounts receivable beginning ng January 1 of year 2, i-add back natin yung 50,000 sa 850,000. Alright? Para makita natin yung ating accounts receivable beginning. So, ang ibig sabihin, ang ating accounts receivable beginning ay 900,000. Then, tingnan natin kung anong nangyari sa buong taon ng year 2. Credit sales during the year were 1,200,000. So, sa credit sales, that's an addition to our accounts receivable beginning. Kasi ang entry natin sa credit sales is debit to accounts receivable and credit to sales. So, when you debit an accounts receivable, nag-a-add ka po sa accounts receivable mo. Alright? So, we add our credit sales. Then, and collections from customer, excluding recoveries, totaled 1,050,000. So, sa collections, anong effect niya sa ating accounts receivable? Sa collections po is debit to a cash, so nakolekta natin na 1,050,000 and we credit the accounts receivable, which is minus to our accounts receivable. Alright? So, ima-minus natin yung collection na 1,050,000. In the year, accounts receivable of 35,000 were written off and 18,000 were recovered. So, anong effect ng ating write-off sa ating accounts receivable beginning? So, ang effect ng ating write-off or ang entry natin sa write-off is debit to the allowance for uncollectible accounts and credit to accounts receivable. So, kapag nag-credit ka ng accounts receivable, mina-minus natin yan sa ating accounts receivable. So, ang write-off, ang effect niya sa ating accounts receivable is minus. So, we minus our write-off of 35,000. And 18,000 were recovered. Remember, kapag meron tayong recovery, ang una nating gagawin ay isi-set up muna natin yung accounts receivable sa nasingil natin, sa na-recover nating amount. Okay? We debit our accounts receivable and we credit our allowance for doubtful accounts. Tsaka natin i-record yung kinolekta natin. So, we will debit to cash and we credit the accounts receivable. Alright? So, ang ibig sabihin, wala yung effect dito sa ating accounts receivable. Dahil nag-debit ka ng accounts receivable, nag-credit ka din na accounts receivable sa nakolekta mo. Sunset estimated that 45,000 of the accounts receivable at December 31st were uncollectible. So, anong ibig sabihin nun? Binigay na ng problem kung magkano ang ending balance ng ating allowance for uncollectible accounts. So, there are three methods. We have our aging of the accounts receivable, the percentage of the accounts receivable, at ng percentage of credit sales. So, problem natin, binigay na yung amount mismong allowance for uncollectible accounts ending. Yung amount na makukuha natin sa aging of accounts receivable or ng percentage of accounts receivable, itong amount na yan na po yung ending balance natin. To get our uncollectible account expense or ang ating bad debts expense, ipa-plug in mo lang dito yon. Pero kapag ang ginagamit ng company ay ang percentage of credit sales, alright? Kung ito ang ginagamit niya, itong amount mismo na ito, yan na po yung uncollectible account expense mo. So, meron ka ng amount dito, i-add mo lang yan, makukuha mo na ang iyong ending balance of your allowance for uncollectible account. Ang sabi ng problem is, Sunset estimated that 45,000 of the accounts receivable at December 31st were uncollectible. So, binigay na yung mismong amount ng uncollectible. So, ito na po ang ating ending balance ng ating allowance for uncollectible accounts. Yan na rin po ang ima-minus natin dito to get our accounts receivable net of allowance for uncollectible accounts. Alright? So, our answer is 970,000. And our answer is letter B. Alright, question number 10 tayo. The amount collected from customers on accounts receivable during the year 4 was. So, ang tinatanong na naman dito sa problem na ito ay collection. So, collection problems ulit tayo. Alright? Alam mo kung sinong expert sa collection problems? Mga Bombay. Joke lang po. Alright, let's start. So, two company had an accounts receivable of 1,650,000 on December 31st, year 3. So, ang tinatanong ng problem natin, year 4. Okay? Yung collections ng year 4. Itong 1,650,000 ay ending balance last year ng December 31st, year 3. Alright? So, yan ang magiging beginning balance natin ng January 1st of year 4. Alright? So, dyan tayo mag-uumpisa. So, we have a accounts receivable beginning of 1,650,000. 1,750,000 on December of year 4. So, yan po ang ating ending balance ng ating accounts receivable. Alright? The company wrote off 400,000 of accounts receivable during year 4. So, anong effect ng ating write-off sa ating accounts receivable? Ano bang entry natin sa ating write-off? Debit to allowance for uncollectible accounts and credit to the accounts receivable. So, minus po ang ating accounts receivable beginning, amounting to 400,000. Sales for the year 4 totaled 6 million and all sales were on account. So, lahat po ng 6 million ay credit sales natin. Alright? So, ano bang effect ng credit sales sa ating accounts receivable? That is additions to our accounts receivable. Alright? Kasi ang entry natin is debit to accounts receivable and credit to sales. So, our credit sales is 6 million. Ang hinahanap ng problem natin ay collections, okay? Ima-minus natin dito po yung collections natin. Ang effect ng collections sa ating accounts receivable ay minus, alright? At yan po ang hinahanap ng problem. So, ipa-plug in mo lang yung missing amount or our collection is 5,500,000. So, our answer is letter C.